So this artistic here. Switching. Okay. Okay. So you get a star here, for example, or you put a mark here, and down here on this column, they begin telling you the reason. The reasons are sometimes stated at the introduction of the article. Sometimes you find the reason. They would say, we chose to use so-and-so because papers previously proved that this was not effective, so we excluded that step from our study. Sometimes you find it in the introduction, in the literature review in the introduction. Sometimes you find these explanations in the methodology section. They will tell you we use this wave, for example, because this is more relevant to the dye we're using. Or this type of stereo microscope with such and such modification, because this is more suitable for the fluorescent. Or they would say, we did not use this fluorescent dye because it mimics staining. So if we have staining in the sample, it will give us a false positive. They begin explaining. These bits and pieces of explanation, this is experience. This is the wisdom of research. And this is, you cannot get it from many papers. This is the pure joy of your mind when you begin reading those reasons. Why? And this gives you strength when you're discussing it. Because sometimes in an examination committee, they would ask you, well, I've read a paper that goes so and so and so, but you tell them, okay, they have stored in water, for example, in that paper. The problem, I'm not sure, I might not be sure about that paper, for example. It was not included, for example, in my literature review, but they might have used water as a storage. Here I'm using, for example, not water, regular tap water. They would tell you, some papers even are very frank, and they would tell you, we use just tap water to store the samples. Or they would say, we put sodium hypochlorite. Or they would say, we put formaldehyde. Formaldehyde fixes tissue. You cannot test microleakage with samples stored with formaldehyde, because dentine behaves differently when it coagulates under the effect of formaldehyde. Some people would say, no, we used a solution that had protein in it, and it has a osmolality similar to that of saliva. So see how you begin to get the grip of why papers are better than others, and why do they more relevant to the clinical situation than others. Yes, we are doing in vitro research. I do admit we are doing limited research with limited, and we always write that sentence within the limitations of this study we have concluded. I know this, but why not know your limitations and know your strengths as well? So by this methodology, you begin knowing the whys. For example, somebody would tell you, as I told you, with the aging, with the fatigue testing, they would tell you, if you begin from 0 and then put as force, you are testing impact strength, not actual strength. You're not cycling fatigue. You are going from impact strength to compressive strength, and that's another behavior, especially in porcelains and zirconias. They behave differently under impact other than regular strength. And you know that. Like if you have a porcelain crown in your mouth, it will serve for years, and under a small pebble that you've eaten suddenly with your food, it goes away, it chips away. It has been functioning 20 years in the mouth. It behaves differently under impact force. So that's where it goes. So these bits and pieces of knowledge, I like them. These are like the pieces of cherries in the cake. Begin picking them up. From each study you get these. Some of them, as I told you, you find them in the discussions. And sometimes you find papers that are totally dedicated to differentiate between them. For example, you will find a review, there is a review, where it states and tests the difference between bovine and human dentine, and actually gives you the reasons and the bits and pieces. And the whole study aim was to find the difference. So there are some studies that only aim to find the difference of storage periods. So even you get those, and those are the pieces of the sweet in between reading research. They strengthen your conclusions. Okay? So you also add those types of papers in. But because we had this artistic, and the reasons are written down here, this is where you build your knowledge as a researcher, a true researcher. Not a researcher guided, monkey see, monkey do. يعني خلاص, supervisor tells them, do this and this, and he goes and does this and this. And doesn't know why. Okay, this is where you really develop the scientific reasoning behind the research wisdom. Okay, after you finish the testing stage, we go, you will find more and more, and you will, I know, you will be adding more and more columns because each paper will add to this. It's growing, as I told you. It's like it's like a fungus growing, and it's beautiful to watch it growing, by the way. Alaykum assalam. And it's beautiful, by the way, to watch it growing because you know your mind is growing, because your mind is beginning to specify pieces of information and you're absorbing it. It's not passively going through your mind. It's now going in, finding a place to stay, and it stays. So that you get strength from reading papers. So that's what we talked about, waste of time. It's not the number of articles you've read. For me, I measure my students as, how many articles did you put in this table? This is how I measure my students. Okay? So, going to the post-testing stage, what happens post-testing? Post-testing will begin looking at what do you do to the samples after you tested them. Okay? Sometimes they include, for example, fatigue testing. We do some tests, and then after they fracture, we go and look at them at the microscope. So after failure, this happens after the testing itself. We go and see in microscope, for example. Some people do a follow-up, especially in clinical studies. They begin following up the patient, and you get periods of follow-up, for example. So let's say post-testing. What is post-testing? What do they do for samples after? After, for example, viewing, evaluation, maybe follow-up periods. Here also you have recommendations for future research. Because their studies had opened the door, they recommend doing so and so in the future. So they're actually guiding you to a paper ready to do, or a research ready to do. Because they could not go further. And then sometimes even questions raised by this research. And the more and more of the publications are reporting negative results or non-significant results, we're getting more and more about the knowledge here. This is very good, beautiful knowledge. And what to do further. They would tell you, within the limitations of our study, we did so and so and so. We recommend that next papers would do and concentrate on so and so in this angle of research. Okay, so recommendations, they could be questions raised by this research. Sometimes papers would go for limitations. What were our limitations? They begin talking about their limitations of their study, and they become very frank about it. And for example, one of the limitations of studies that have doing caries is the bias, because sometimes the researcher is the same one who does the evaluation. But they are frank about it, and they get their paper published. They're frank. We did not have an independent body or an independent researcher for evaluation because of the limitations of the fund, limitations of the place, limitations of so and so. So the researcher who done the actual intervention is the same researcher who done the evaluation. But, for example, they would say, we took photographs and we also sent them for an external evaluator. So more and more you get to know these bits and pieces, how to do and further validate your research under the umbrella of limitations. You're still talking about limited. There is no research that tests everything.
Is it better to mention limitations?
No, this is your strength. This is your strength. In an article, published article, I could not answer you, but I would consider it as a strength. As a reviewer, I would consider it as a strength. Some journals will think that the more limitations, that means the poorer the paper is. But no, I would say, because I'm a reviewer of a number of journals, I've been also a reviewer of multiple journals. The more and more I get people writing honest limitations, those even strengthen me. I'm a reviewer anyway, and they've done the research, but still they strengthen me in my research methodology as well. So I would say no problem. Okay. But of course, don't ruin your value by stating limitations. You can't state major limitations. But the expert would say anyway, the in vitro test itself is a limitation by its. Yes, it has its limitation in terms of clinical reliability. So anyway, but I'm still under that umbrella anyway, and I know I'm under that limitation. So I'm fine with that. Okay? So, what do I want you to do? Before we go to our second stage, I want you to do only 3 papers.
3 papers.
3.
Inserting
Only.
the information.
Just building this Excel sheet. There we will discover your problems with Excel itself. Excel itself is a program, like any program. There is a learning curve for it. You might not know how to add a column. You might not know how to join cells. You might not know how to add an artistic, how to develop a table and a separate table beneath it, and so on. Even those technical skills, you will develop them by going. And if you have any question at the time, just to let me know. Okay? To build that.
Okay. I just have another question. There's something called a pilot study or something.
Pilot study.
Pilot study. Is it a trial, like a trial of my study to,
Yes.
to discover what is the...
Pilot study is something else, but I would not go for a pilot study for my students. I mean, if they have not done at least 20 papers of this critical methodology, critical view at the methodology, I would not let them go through the pilot study. Even the pilot study is sometimes even more important than the main study, but because it guides you into the machines. Are they present or not? The technician, is he ready or not? The facilities, what are the paperwork regarding that facility? What are the issues? Yani it teaches you so much that once you want to run the actual study, you don't want those obstacles appearing. So it trains yourself. But I don't usually allow my student to go through even a pilot study unless they've done at least 20 papers like this.
Okay, I'm just asking about amount of the sample I need for my real study, for example, 50 teeth, okay? For a pilot study, I just need, for example, for 2 or 3 teeth, and just running.
Yeah, the pilot study, number of samples, this is something you calculate with your statistician. بيسموها sample size calculations. You have to study them with your supervisor, with the statistician, because the statistician will be running old numbers through a test and seeing how many samples he has to get to prove statistical significance. Okay, so usually we do that after having a number of studies and showing that unit of change that we're measuring. Okay, so that is for my students, as I told you, I don't actually let them do it unless they've done 20 papers, at least this critical appraisal. And then I let them go through the number of samples, because one of the things here in the pre-testing, the numbers of samples we're adding. See, whenever you read more, whenever you discuss your research more, you begin adding in columns. For the pre-testing, sample calculation. Some good papers, they will tell you how did they calculate their sample. And they will actually give you the sample calculation equation they used with their statistician. Okay? Or they would write a very clear sentence about sample calculation to detect a difference of so and so under the significance of 0.05. Okay? They would say for this unit of testing, this amount of numbers, we needed this. So they already have done this calculation. So this is a good thing about sample calculation, that the more you read of papers, you might discover a paper that already done this sample calculation using the same units, using the same devices, using the same methodology of your research. You might discover a twin paper for you, let's say a twin paper. Okay? But they are testing so-and-so material and you're testing X and Y material. So you're different, but they have done the calculations, so that saves you time. And even guides you how to calculate samples. But you have to go through that experience of sample calculation. Okay? And as I told you, other than the research methodology, pilot studies also develop your facility management. Because once you go to the research, you hate to discover at the end of your research that there was a device that you might have used that saved you a lot of time. Or maybe you have used a reference point that is not reliable, and so on. Okay? So, homework, 2 papers, 3 papers, 3 papers, better. Develop your table. Finish with somebody expert with computers how to add columns and omit columns and so on. And finish that, and let's go for the second session. We will film it after you have finished that homework. Okay?
I will do the extraction of information.
Extraction of information and putting it into Excel.
Bring it.
No, I want it and copy and paste and put here under the table. The table is filled in. Copy and paste.
I just prepare the table
Yes. Prepare the table, columns, and put in the data.
and put in the tab.
Yes. Okay. Okay. See you next time, inshallah.